Okay, this presentation is meant to be an introduction really to Chapter 1. It's the first of the content-oriented presentations for this unit. So we will be covering what is theory, the practice of theory, and the theory of practice, breaking down the practice-theory divide, and I want to give you a preview of key terms. This is really going to be pretty short. It's just meant to be an introduction and sort of a segue into reading Chapter 1 of the text. So, what is theory? Probably a word you've all heard of. We might think about other questions to answer this question. So, for example, what do we mean when we say, theoretically, mass communication technologies are making information readily available to more people than ever before, but I'm not so sure. So that's one use of the word theory or theoretically. How is that different from saying, I have a theory about why you shy away from commitment? Whoa, okay, so that's a pretty different use of the word theory, right? Although perhaps they're somewhat related. Or how is it different from, that's just theory mumbo jumbo? These are three very different uses of the word theory or variations on the term. And so if you're thinking about what is theory, you might even pause this presentation and take a minute to jot down on some sticky notes or just on some scratch paper, what do you think of when you hear the word theory? What are some different ways in which you use the term and for what purposes, right? So I'll let you jot those down for a second, and then when you're ready, you can resume the presentation. Okay, so if you're thinking about what is theory, you may say, based on some of these quotes or possibilities here, you might say it's an uncertainty marker. So in the first example up here, theoretically doesn't really get at theory in terms of grand theories, although it could. It's really a way of starting this sentence to imply that, well, we're not really certain, right, about this, but it's possible that this is what's happening with mass communication technologies. This actually gets at the notion that in the scientific community, theory itself theories are not facts, right? So in this case, it functions as an uncertainty marker. Theories are not necessarily certain. We might also say that a theory is an idea that we want to test out, right? And so someone who's doing a study on communication technologies could test out whether it's true or not that communication technologies are making information readily available to more people or not, right? Or you could test out this whole theory about why you shy away from commitment, right? That's something that in your daily life, you could test that out, right? We might also say that a theory is an explanation for something, right? And so that's sort of implicit in this notion of having a theory about why you shy away from commitment. Or, you'll see in chapter 1 of the text a very short little snippet about a teacher who is trying to explain or find reasons why a student of hers really is not engaging in self-selected reading and is just pretending to read. And she has a theory about why it might be, and then what she might do about it to test out that theory. We might also say in this last example, that's just theory mumbo jumbo. That theory is or alluding to theory is a form of dismissing an idea. Unfortunately, there's a long history in the field of education of sort of a theory practice divide. And I really want to convince you this semester that need not be the case. In fact, in reality, there is very little theory practice divide. In fact, there may not be a theory practice divide. Really, the idea is that theory and practice are intertwined. But when people say something like that's just theory mumbo jumbo, it's a way of saying, I just want to deal with the here and now and the way things are. And maybe not wanting to entertain other ideas about how things could be different. So in my mind, that's one of the practical uses of theory, that it can really help us think differently about the world. and in our case, about literacy and literacy development and literacy learning and literacy teaching. So here's a little visual that gets at this theory practice divide. Many people, when asked what is theory, they'll be like, what's the opposite of practice, right? Or if somebody's asked what's practice, well, it's practical. It's not all that theory mumbo jumbo, right? Now, Beck, the musician, might say that classroom practice, that's where it's at. No need to deal with theory because classroom practice is where all the interesting stuff happens. Actually, I would agree with that to a certain extent, right? Other people might say, theory, that's kind of square, right? Or theory's too fancy for me. I actually think, again, that this is a false dichotomy. So let's talk about some key concepts and terms, right? We can talk about epistemologies. Actually, we're not going to talk about epistemologies too much this semester, but you're going to be introduced to this term in Chapter 1, and theories and practices are always related to epistemologies, okay? I'm going to leave it at that. I'm not going to go any farther. Although we could just generally say that epistemologies are sort of broad philosophical ways of understanding how the world works. And assumptions about the world, what it means to know, what it means to be, things like that. Big questions. And then we can get at theories. And I have theories here in pink for a reason. You were probably wondering why marketing was floating over there on the right-hand side of your screen. That's because marketing is very much integral to curricular models or instructional approaches, okay? One of the things that I want to do in Chapter 1, and what I want you to think about when you're reading that is what the difference is between a model and a theory. A lot of people are going to use these terms interchangeably. I argue, and many other people do, that they're a little bit different. You'll see in the book, in particular in Chapter 2, which you're going to be reading later, in Chapter 2, I write about some theoretical orientations, in particular information processing, that uses the word model a lot. And so you're going to hear me use that word. But really, in terms of the course as a whole, we want to think about a model as more of a little bit more concrete than a theory. So curricular models might include, that you might be familiar with, might include things such as Socratic seminars, right, as a whole approach, or the Paideia approach in secondary context. Or in elementary school classrooms, you might be familiar with the cafe approach, or comprehension strategies instruction, or a workshop approach. Those are all curricular models, and they're delineated in pretty specific ways about how instruction should unfold, right? And those reflect certain theories about how teaching and learning may occur. And in this context, we might think about theories as explanatory systems for how literacy teaching and learning occur. And then the model would be sort of a way of saying, based on that theory, this is what you ought to do, right? And this all also relates to instructional strategies. This gets down to the nitty-gritty of what you're doing, not what a curriculum tells you should be doing or suggests you should do, but what you're actually doing in a classroom. You will note that I have theories and instructional strategies in pink or peach, and they're exciting and they're highlighted, and that's because I view both of those things as related to what many people will refer to as praxis, and I'll offer you a definition of that in a bit, and you'll also encounter this all in Chapter 1. But praxis sounds like the word practice, and honestly, I can't tell you why they spell it that way. I'm sure it's some Latin thing that I'm unaware of. But basically, what praxis refers to is the intersection of theory and practice, of what happens in instruction, in everyday instructional engagements, and how, as you may be engaging instruction, you may be bringing theory into it, right? a little bit maybe more explicitly than you may have in the past. Praxis is really that exciting place where theory and practice both come to the fore at the same time. So again, I guess I like to think of it as theoretically infused practice and practically infused theory. So we'll come back to that term, and you'll also get at that, read about that term in chapter 1. Although I have curricular models in gray and not highlighted in pink, we will be talking about that. And one of the ways I've organized the book is that each chapter of the book, each chapter of the first half of the book has a grounding curricular model that's presented fairly close to the beginning of each chapter, that's meant to really contextualize the theories that are presented in the chapter. And I have all of the stuff on marketing because that's really where marketing tends to occur, right? In the field of education. Marketing and book publishers and whatnot tend to not be targeting theories, let alone epistemologies. They're certainly connected to them, but they're not targeting them. And same with instructional strategies, although there's probably more of a connection to sort of marketing and publishers to strategies than there are to models. But really, this is the primary place where, when you buy a professional text, oftentimes you're buying a model or some arguments for particular models and approaches to instruction. They may include a lot of information about instructional strategies, and they may talk about theories. But really, I think it's those approaches and models where marketing happens. And oftentimes marketing, when things are marketed, they're not marketing a theory directly, but they're often not even taking you to this theoretical realm or epistemological realm. And so I think that when we just limit our professional development and our reading to commercially produced materials and marketed texts, it's sort of like if you're at the International Reading Association or at Illinois Reading Council conference and if you go into the exhibit hall, that's like heaven for marketers, right? And if you limit yourself to what's in that exhibition hall, I think there's a lot that you may not be seeing. So that's one of the reasons I put that in this presentation. So. Oh, look at this. It's colorful and there's just a lot going on here. This is sort of a crazy version of a figure that you're going to see in chapter 1, and it's meant to get at this continuum between epistemologies, theories, models, and strategies. And again, you'll read about this in chapter 1, but what I wanted to do was give you some examples of epistemologies, some examples of theories, some examples of curricular models, and some examples of strategies. So let's start with some strategies. Some of you, in your own work, you might be familiar with a strategy of modeling and asking students to produce digital book trailers, or perhaps doing craft writing, right? Many of you might use worksheets or be familiar with round robin reading. You might have engaged your students in critical inquiry or process drama. And what have you, or, maybe you use graphic organizers a lot and have, really teach comprehension strategies. So there's a whole bunch more that could be put in these, in this column here, but those are just some examples of things that you might be familiar with. And generally speaking, and I really want to emphasize generally speaking, these things can be associated with curricular models and then aligned with theories and aligned with epistemologies. So, for example, isolated skill drill worksheets, round robin reading, which are not recommended. Now, worksheets, I might recommend other things like response sheets and graphic organizers. I would say that's different from like isolated skill drill worksheets. But these kinds of practices here are going to be strongly associated with models such as DIBELS, Daily Oral Language, Success for All, Harcourt Trophies, SRA, and these are very much informed by behaviorism and information processing models, as well as some stage theories, which I don't have in here. A lot of this we'll be reading about in chapter 2. And they're also associated with radical empiricism, positivism, and objectivist epistemologies. So just an example. And you can see similar alignments along some of these other rows here. However, it's not necessarily so cut and dried. So, for example, there are many people in many school districts that use reading and writing workshop, for example. And within a reading and writing workshop, which tends to be informed by sociocultural historical theory and emergent literacy, there are many people in many districts that will take it up in more delineated, linear, and regimented ways, right? Where, okay, we're all going to be, everyone's, for writing workshop, for example, everybody's going to be writing the same kind of piece, genre. And we're all going to pre-write on Monday, and everybody's going to write a draft on Tuesday, and everybody's going to revise on Wednesday, et cetera, all the way through Friday where you publish your work. And that sort of, that reading model, that process model, writing model, that process model of writing is very much integral to writing workshop. But that way of doing it that's very structured and one size fits all is really much more aligned with behaviorist theories and epistemologies of objectivism, right? And so what happens there, and this is why I think classroom practice is where all the exciting stuff happens, because it's in classroom practice where it's really, that's where the rubber meets the road. That's where theories are brought to life. And so somebody could be implementing writing workshop in a way that in some ways reflects these theories, maybe even some of these. But it may also very strongly reflect some of these, which you wouldn't necessarily think of just looking at this chart. So theoretically, I could draw an arrow that goes all the way from here and wind it around and come all the way down to reading and writing workshop. So that would be kind of interesting. So I guess I want you could very well imagine this chart without all those little arrows, and you could imagine a little bit more like a scatter plot where there aren't cut and dried relationships between these things. Okay, so this is my last slide, so you can delve into chapter 1. This is just a preview of key terms. I'm not going to read over all of these things. You're going to see very similar phrasing and definitions of these terms in chapter 1, but these will be very helpful terms for you as you move through the book and as you move through the course of a whole. Praxis, epistemology, theory, curricular model, which sometimes might be referred to as an instructional model, and then instructional strategies. So that's that, and happy reading. I'll see you in the third presentation.